You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez.
To realize that we are the descendants of 40 million people who left other countries, other familiar scenes, to come here to the United States to build a new life.
If you grew up in the U.S., if you've heard it once, you've heard it a million times. Our diversity is our strength.
Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas.
We believe our diversity, our differences, when joined together by a common set of ideals, makes us stronger.
But in the 21st century, out of the shadow of the Cold War, when making diversity work was part of our boast to the rest of the world about the soundness and universality of our system, doubt has crept in.
We're witnessing the newest evolution of the culture wars.
The divisions are real and drawn along partisan lines. Several studies...
And doubt has spoken louder and louder in ways I never could have expected. In a torchlight parade in Charlottesville, Virginia. In Congress members musing out loud about scrapping birthright citizenship.
We need to do everything we can to secure the border, and ending birthright citizenship is one of the ways you end the incentives to cross the border illegally.
In a nighttime TV talk show host speculating that newcomers simply don't share the values held by you real Americans.
An unrelenting stream of immigration. But why? Well, Joe Biden just said it. To change the racial mix of the country. That's the reason, to reduce the political power.
The question is, how do we speak to the great majority of a country who, when you look at polls, recognize the contributions of immigrants, think of America as a country that should be open to immigration, but also have a set of concerns about some of the challenges that might raise.
That's Yascha Mounk, author of The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fail and How They Can Endure. We spoke with him in 2022, just after the book was published. It was released during a period when it felt like things were just getting back to normal, a time a lot of us were grasping for some hope after 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mounk's book made a case for the multi-ethnic democracy, why it should exist, why it's an antidote to nativism, populism, and pessimism. After the results of the 2024 presidential election, we're revisiting my conversation with Yascha Mounk, because it has lessons that we should remember during a second Donald Trump term. Well, when two Americans get to talking, it is not unusual for one to ask the other, "What are you?" Or perhaps more politely put, "Where's your family from?" Is that question part of the social dance of getting acquainted?
No, so there's many parts of the world in which people assume that you are from the same place, which is to say that not just you were born in a particular place, but that your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were also part of the same country. And that if you weren't, that really means that you don't belong. So I always feel a little bit torn about this question in the United States. I understand why many people feel that it is a kind of, as the fashionable term puts it, microaggression, that it's a way of insinuating, well, you're not white, and so therefore you can't really be from here. I've also sometimes found that it can be a form of open curiosity, that it can be part of our understanding that people come from all parts of the world to the United States, that they are full Americans, no matter where they come from or where their parents came from, and that nevertheless, that origin is an important part of their story and one that they might be curious about. So I think perhaps we need to find a new question, I don't know exactly what it would be, which indicates, look, I know that you're fully American as much as me, and if we're getting to know each other, if I'm not, accosting somebody on the street, I'm nevertheless expressing that curiosity in an open-minded way. I think it would be nice if we could find the way to do that, for I'm not sure that I exactly know how to.
So Yascha, what are you?
Well, I am a German Jew. My parents and grandparents were in the wrong place at the wrong time for many generations. I myself ended up being born and growing up in Germany. I lived in Italy and France, went to college in Britain, and came to the United States for graduate school and never really left. and was very proud in the spring of 2017 to swear to defend the laws and the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
The book begins when you ask, back in Germany, we are embarking on a historically unique experiment, that of turning a monoethnic and monocultural democracy into a multi-ethnic one. Had it occurred to you for a long time that that's what Germany was up to?
Yes, in many ways. When the first successful German democracy gets founded after World War II, the country was very homogeneous, in part because of the terrible crimes of the first half of the 20th century. And so in 1950, there's Catholics and Protestants, there was people who had origins in parts of the world that are today in Poland, but there really wasn't very much ethnic diversity, and there was very little religious diversity. Over the last 40 or 50 years, Germany has experienced a lot of immigration. In fact, something that Americans often don't know, that Germans often don't know, is that Germany now has as many people born outside of the country as the United States does. And so the nature and the social fabric of the country has radically changed. This makes what we're doing in Germany today a unique historical experiment. We don't have a precedent for it. People did not actually consciously try to bring this result about, and that we now lack the rules and the instruction manual for how to make it work. That we're encountering a great experiment like the framers of the United States Constitution were embarking on a great experiment in the late 18th century, when at a time when there wasn't much precedent for self-governing republics, they were trying to build a new kind of form of government. But what was misunderstood and perhaps deliberately misinterpreted by some people to say that what's really going on is that some people are deliberately trying to replace the population. So you can see how easily this topic can lead to misunderstandings and how readily it can be abused for these terrible conspiracy theories, which in the United States as well have justified forms of domestic terrorism.
It's not at all unusual to hear Germans assign traits and tendencies to people from various parts of the country. As you mentioned, there were people in the country after 1950 who were from Czechoslovakia, Sudeten Germans. There were Silesian Germans from South Poland. Were they really the same as someone from Munich or Hamburg? Do they really become German and monoethnic only when they're compared to an outsider like a Syrian or a Turk?
Look, no society in the world thinks of itself as completely homogeneous. Even societies that from the outside look relatively, comparatively homogeneous have deep political divisions. South Korea recently had an election, and even though the country, again, appears from the outside to be much less diverse than a place like the United States, it was an incredibly heated and contested election because the partisan divisions, as well as some religious and other divisions in the country, go very, very deep. So I agree with much of the premise of your point. And the second point, which is important, is that the kinds of boundaries we draw, the ways in which we define who's in and who's out, really vary from place to place. And it's very important not to start to think that there's a natural order of who belongs in which group, and that's unchanging. The particular kind of census categories that the United States has ended up with, and that many Americans now use to think about their country, are very artificial. The concept of an Asian American uniting people from China and from India under the same category. The concept of a Latino or Hispanic uniting somebody, all of whose ancestors may come from Spain, and somebody who has Native American stock from South America, is an artificial construct, and we should be much more critical in how we think about it. At the same time, I do think that there's some qualitative differences, and whatever differences there were within Germany in 1950, between Catholics and Protestants, between people from different parts of the country, are smaller than the differences we now have between people who grew up in Germany, who have ancestors, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents who all lived in German-speaking lands, and people who have immigrated in the last decades from Turkey, from Asia, from Africa, who might be Hindu or Muslim or Jewish and so on. I think that is just qualitatively a bigger difference. And given the human instinct construct towards drawing boundaries, those kind of salient differences make it unfortunately easier for people to say, hey, we belong, but those people over there, they don't belong. And so they raise the level of difficulty of building these diverse democracies in a successful way.
It's not at all unusual to hear Germans assign traits and tendencies to people from various parts of the country. As you mentioned, there were people in the country after 1950 who were from Czechoslovakia, Sudeten Germans. There were Silesian Germans from South Poland. Were they really the same as someone from Munich or Hamburg? Do they really become German and monoethnic only when they're compared to an outsider like a Syrian or a Turk?
Look, no society in the world thinks of itself as completely homogeneous. Even societies that from the outside look relatively, comparatively homogeneous have deep political divisions. South Korea recently had an election, and even though the country, again, appears from the outside to be much less diverse than a place like the United States, it was an incredibly heated and contested election because the partisan divisions, as well as some religious and other divisions in the country, go very, very deep. So I agree with much of the premise of your point. And the second point, which is important, is that the kinds of boundaries we draw, the ways in which we define who's in and who's out, really vary from place to place. And it's very important not to start to think that there's a natural order of who belongs in which group, and that's unchanging. You know, the particular kind of census categories that the United States has ended up with, and that many Americans now use to think about their country, are very artificial. The concept of an Asian American uniting people from China and from India under the same category. The concept of a Latino or Hispanic uniting somebody, all of whose ancestors may come from Spain, and somebody who has Native American stock from South America, is an artificial construct, and we should be much more critical in how we think about it. At the same time, I do think that there's some qualitative differences, and whatever differences there were within Germany in 1950 between Catholics and Protestants, between people from different parts of the country, are smaller than the differences we now have between people who grew up in Germany, who have ancestors, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents who all lived in German-speaking lands, and people who have immigrated in the last decades from Turkey, from Asia, from Africa, who might be Hindu or Muslim or Jewish and so on. I think that is just qualitatively a bigger difference. And given the human instinct towards drawing boundaries, those kind of salient differences make it unfortunately easier for people to say, hey, we belong, but those people over there, they don't belong. And so they raise the level of difficulty of building these diverse democracies in a successful way.
A lot of what operates as nationalism in the 21st century is treated as if it's a natural thing, an outgrowth of the natural variety of the human state, of where people come from in the world. But so many boundaries that divide nations are absolutely artificial. They're contrivances. And in fact, colonialism gave us many of the boundaries that now cause so much of the conflict you write about as we try to make one nation out of different people, whether it's Muslims and Christians in the north and south of Nigeria, between English and French speakers in Cameroon, or regionally dominant ethnic groups in Kenya and South Africa. Short of breaking them up into little ethno-states, and at the same time trying to not have it become India and Pakistan all over again, what would work better than what they've tried so far? Federalism, which has been the answer in a lot of places, has fallen well short of the mark. And you identify this in the book, that trying to let people still be themselves while we all still exist inside this national border sounds great, and you can tell why people want to try it, but it ends up not working either.
Yeah, so some amount of regional decision-making can be very helpful, right? Certainly in a place like Canada, giving French speakers in Quebec a little bit more autonomy has been part of what so far has kept the country together. Where I become very, very skeptical is when you don't have clearly demarcated geographic regions, but you have people living together in the whole territory from different groups, and you say, you're all going to be living by completely different rules. So Lebanon is an extreme example of that. The country has interspersed throughout its territory many different religious groups, particularly Sunnis, Shias, and Maronite Christians. And the solution in 1943 was to say, well, we're going to devolve the most important kinds of political decisions to the level of each community. So the laws that govern your marriage and your divorce and your inheritance and your education and all of those other important social issues isn't made by the national parliament. It's made separately by Shias, Sunnis, and Maronite Christians. And that was meant to stave off civil war and lower the stakes of national politics. But it's failed across a number of dimensions. One of them is that it's actually deprived members of these groups of true self-determination. Because if you're a Shia or a Sunni, for example, you don't actually get to have democratic say in those laws. It is religious authorities which make them for you. The second is that there's no sense of shared Lebanese identity. And in fact, the system heavily discourages any kind of connection between members of different groups. So 2 friends of mine in Lebanon who got married did not have the marriage formally recognized by the state for many years because they come from different religious groups. And the third point is that actually the main goal of staving off civil war didn't work because Lebanon did end up having a long and cruel civil war. And so what is the answer? There's no easy answer, but one of the things we have to do is to give people 2 freedoms at the same time. The first, to be true to their most cherished beliefs and identities, to ensure that if they want to worship in the way of their ancestors, they can. If they want to sustain some of the cultural rights of their ancestors, they can. And one of the choices that people in a free society should be able to make is to give great importance to those kind of subnational identity groups. And we should recognize and celebrate that. But the second is that they also have to be free to cooperate across the lines of those groups. But they also have to be free to say, Mommy and Daddy, I don't want to live like you're living. I'm going to go out and choose my own partner in life. I'm going to go out and choose a profession I might not approve of. I might move away to a different city within this country. And we have to ensure that they're able to do that and that we have enough connective tissue, that enough people in the country make the choice of forging new connections with each other, founding new companies and civic associations with each other, having contact with each other across those group boundaries. And I can say, I'm a Muslim or Christian, I have roots in Mexico or Vietnam or Italy that are important to me, but I'm also an American, and that also means something significant to me.
If you look at the laws of the United States before 1965, we paid a lot of lip service to the idea that we could transcend all our boundaries, make common cause, and be one people. There was a great deal of weight given to where in Europe different people come from. But all of those people were white or would become talked of as white down the road. And I'm wondering whether the trick of having a multi-ethnic state has to run into the reality of race being a more difficult frontier to transcend than where in Europe your ancestors came from.
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that we've made big progress in some of these questions, not in every respect. But I'm really struck by the fact that in 1960, 6% of Americans thought that it was morally acceptable for a white and an African American to intermarry. Even as late as the early 1990s, a majority of Americans still thought it was immoral for whites and African Americans to intermarry. Today, that figure is down to 6%. That is a tremendous progress over the course of a lifetime. And we know, by the way, that this is not just people telling pollsters what they think they're supposed to say, but also a real sociological transformation, because we can look at the number of interracial newborns in the United States. So at the most intimate level, many Americans are deciding to transcend those boundaries. And that, I think, we should take some comfort from. More broadly, I think I agree with you that some of those distinctions make it harder, right? There's qualitative differences in how different people are. And it was easier for people to come to say, hey, these Irish and Italian immigrants who perhaps we mistrusted at the beginning, but in the end, they're not so different. They come from the same continent and they appear more similar phenotypically, as opposed to, people who come from different continents and ethnicities that are in a more salient way, more visually different. I do think that is the way in which we've become much more deeply diverse, and that raises the level of difficulty. I think that's right. At the same time, when I look at the best studies of what's going on in both Western Europe and North America, they actually are reason for tremendous optimism. So on parts of the far right, I hear about immigration today. Yeah, these Irish and Italian immigrants, they could succeed because they had the right kind of culture and the right kind of religion and perhaps even, quote unquote, the right kind of race. But immigrants today from Mexico or El Salvador or Vietnam or Kenya and Nigeria, they're not going to succeed because they don't share those traits. That's the claim of parts of the far right. Now, much of the mainstream and much of the left, certainly most of my friends and acquaintances, would rightly reject that insinuation of inferiority. But they actually often echo a similar kind of pessimism because they say, well, Italian and Irish immigrants could succeed because they were white, but these immigrants today, they're being discriminated against in such terrible ways because they're non-white that they don't stand a chance. Now, let me be clear. They do face real discrimination, real injustice, and that's something that we have to fight against every day. But actually, the best sociological studies end up being much more optimistic. The children and grandchildren of immigrants are much more likely to rise the educational ranks and rise the socioeconomic ranks than the children and grandchildren of Americans who've been in the country for much longer. And in fact, the speed of this advance, according to the best study by economists at Stanford and Princeton and a bunch of other universities looking at over 1 million data points, is that the speed of that advance is actually exactly the same as it was for Italian and Irish immigrants about a century ago. And that, I think, should make us more optimistic than a lot of the debate. It should make us reject even more full-throatedly those disgusting insinuations of inferiority from the right, but also reject what I see much more in my milieu, which is the fatalistic belief that the injustices in our society run so deep that immigrants and their descendants are incapable of overcoming them.
Well, some of the conflict that you're talking about turns out to be transitory. So when scholars go out and do the research and do the field work, and they find that immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries are acquiring English at the same speed that earlier generation of immigrants did when they acquired English, when they came here in 1910 or 1920. We know that intellectually, and the paper gets published in a scholarly journal, but there's still the deeply held belief that Spanish speakers are not learning English. I can't tell you how often as a reporter I was doing stories on bilingual education or housing or a local conflict of one kind or another and had it said to me in a simple declaration, these people do not learn English. These people will not learn English. There's a power, isn't there, to beliefs that are held even in the face of evidence that we can't ignore, isn't it?
There is, but I think you're also right that it's transitory, which is to say that, here's a simple optical illusion you could have. And it's sort of understandable how you'd end up having that illusion, right? You look at something like Chinatown in New York City, and you say, well, look, this is really a mark of failure of integration because, you go into Chinatown and a lot of people there don't speak English. And I know this Chinatown has existed 50 years ago and it's existed 100 years ago. So apparently you have this multi-generational failure to integrate. That, of course, is a huge mistake. What's actually going on is that the kids who are born in Chinatown are incredibly successful on average. They certainly speak fluent English, and actually they often outperform residents of many other parts of New York City scholastically and go to very good universities. But there's other immigrants who are continuing to arrive, and when a poor immigrant from China arrives in the country, they start off going and living in Chinatown, and then slowly they move out. And so, you could think, oh, well, there's no integration happening here. What's actually happening is an incredible factory of integration, an incredible success story of integration. And so that's why it's always important in these debates. And I see the right making this mistake, but also many of my friends on the left. You can't just look at averages. You have to look at generations. You have to look at how is the second generation doing, the third generation doing, because that's where the progress usually happens. But I think that integration at some point becomes so evident to the eye that people cease having those beliefs. And I'd love to hear from you. Do you think that people in California believe that less now than they did 20 or 30 years ago, right? In the 1990s, this was a real combustible debate in California. Now it seems to me that most Californians have realized and recognized that, of course, the kids and the grandkids of immigrants from Mexico and other countries in Central and Latin America are integrating and are succeeding. And perhaps there's other parts of the country where some of that immigration is more recent, where they have less experience with that, where people now have the same beliefs that Californians, or many Californians, did in the 1990s. But I would be quite optimistic that in 20 or 30 years, they too come to revise some of their views. Not every single person, but the majority, and that's what ultimately matters in a democracy.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's a perfect example of how bigness can sometimes make this difficult. Because it's very easy to continue to believe that Latinos in California are not assimilating when you live in Indiana, 1,500 miles away. It is very easy to believe what you hear from Tucker Carlson, who is wringing his hands over Hazleton, Pennsylvania, a declining small city up in the state's northeast corner, which has in recent years become home to a large number of Spanish-speaking immigrants. He's devoted several episodes of his program to Hazleton, saying that new population is coming in too fast, that the people who were already living there don't like it, they feel like something's being taken away from them. But when you look at census data, Hazleton was losing population for decades until Spanish speakers began to move in where? From the New York metropolitan area where they were being priced out of real estate. So it wasn't like they were wading across the Rio Grande and winding up in Hazleton. These were people who already had their feet and their lives well planted in American soil and were, in effect, saving the commercial viability of this place, and yet subjected to exclusion, discriminatory laws, and laws, in effect, that were being celebrated by Tucker Carlson, who took the side of people who said, this is happening too fast, I can't handle it. Yes, Hazleton is a very different place from what it was portrayed as, but if you're living 5 states over, you just share with sympathy the bewilderment of the original residents of the place rather than the aspiration of the new arrivals. And that's what's scary about all of this for me.
Yeah, I think that's right. You can always, in a big country like the United States, tell stories about a distant part of a country that are inaccurate and that are inflammatory, and then some people will believe them. But, it seems to me that when you look at polls, Americans are actually quite open to immigration. And it's really striking that the cultural differences between Western Europe and North America are sometimes exaggerated. This is one that's often underestimated. But Americans have much more positive attitudes about migration, about the contribution of migrants than people in a number of European countries. And I think that goes pretty deep in this country. And look, in the years when Donald Trump was president, I was often asked, what do we do about Trump superfans? What do we do to convince those people who are just diehard Trump fans in order to get them off the Trump train? And I always answered, I don't care. If he has 5 or 10% of a population, or let it be 15% of a population that is doggedly attached to him, that certainly, I don't like that as somebody who considers Donald Trump a danger to the American Republic, but we can live with that. The question is about the 50, 60% in the middle, right? The question is about the people who neither really love him nor really hate him, and many of whom ended up voting for him in 2016, right? Those are the people that we have to persuade. I think when it comes to questions like immigration or to questions even like racism, it's a similar thing. You're never going to build a society with no racism at all. Some people are always going to be racist. You're never going to build a society where nobody has a rational prejudice against immigrants. There's always going to be some such people. And for that poses some significant challenges. We can live with that. And I think if we have a clear account of the progress we've made over the last decades as a country on these questions, if we emphasize the true fact that immigrants actually are doing very, very well at advancing socioeconomically, if we emphasize the fact that, yes, there's first-generation immigrants who come here as adults, who come from countries where we didn't have many educational opportunities, but might never learn English, but the kids in the clear majority prefer English when we're speaking to their own siblings or cousins rather than Spanish or Mandarin or whatever the language might be. And by the third generation, they're actually very unlikely to speak any significant amount of the language of their ancestors, which is a melancholy fact. It's not necessarily a purely positive fact, but it's a striking one in this debate. And I think if we're able to emphasize the way in which this integration is succeeding, and if we emphasize a vision of a society which most people would actually be excited to live in, then we can win over the great majority of a population. And that to me is more important than how we argue with the most hardened bigots that might be out there.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, Yascha Mounk on where he finds optimism during this era of international polarization. If you missed any part of this episode, or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You've cited polls a couple of times in our conversation, and I think it's useful to note that in the book, you talk several times about structures, devices that are used to protect minorities, empower majorities, and vice versa, to ease some of the tensions between majorities and minorities and still give everybody a little bit of skin in the game. And right now, we are living through an era where some of the unusual incentives in the American system, in the system we've designed to do some of these things, creates either stalemate or creates disproportionate minority power. You noted that a majority of Americans approve of continued immigration to this country, yet comprehensive immigration reform is stymied by representatives who come from states that are home to a minority of Americans and, incidentally, states that are not home to a large number of immigrants, cumulatively. Right now, we are in the midst of renegotiating the laws that run society around terminating pregnancy in the face of a pronounced minority of Americans who oppose being ever able to terminate pregnancy. We will end up, if the predictions are correct, with a legal regime which bans abortion outright in a large number of states, even though the majority of Americans don't believe in doing that at all. And you analyze and mull over how societies try to ease some of these tensions, how they try to continue to give input and some measure of power to minorities, and the positives and negatives of this. Right now, we're living that in real time. We had 2 presidents elected in the last 20 years without finishing first in the balloting, which is another perversity of the system as seen from other countries, where the winner wins, and that's it.
Yeah, so let me take a big step back here. One of my favorite texts in the American political tradition is number 10 from the Federalist Papers, the 10th Federalist Paper. Because when the framers were thinking about how to run the American Republic, they faced really seemingly insurmountable odds. If you looked around the history of the world in the 1770s, you would have thought that the attempt to build a large-scale self-governing republic was bound to fail, because nearly every attempt at democratic self-governance up till then had, in fact, failed. And the reason why most of them had failed is because of the rise of factions, because society split into 2 groups who hated each other so much that they would rather tear down the political system than live with each other. Now, the normal instinct of anybody would have been, well, factions have always destroyed these societies. What should we do? We should get rid of factions, right? Make sure to put the conditions in place where factions can't succeed. Now, the framers very rightly rejected that solution, because they said the only way to ensure that there's never going to be factions in this country is to deprive people of liberty, to not allow them to have free discussion, free association, to have different kinds of habits, different kinds of interests from each other. And that, they said beautifully, is a cure worse than the disease. And so what they decided to do, they decided to multiply factions, to have so many different Americans in such a large country of so many different origins and groups, but nobody could ever hope to truly be in the majority. And that way, we'd all have to figure out a way to live with each other. That, I think, is the core idea of America's political system. And it's a very clever one. And it works very well, except that we also have an electoral system, which essentially ensures that there are two political parties because of a way that you have whoever wins the most votes in a particular election have representation for that district, which is different from how many other political systems and democracies work. It strongly encourages two political parties because you might want to vote for the Libertarian Party or the Green Party or the Forward Party, but you're not going to because you know that vote is probably going to be wasted. So you're going to choose between Democrats and Republicans, even if you don't particularly love either political party. And that, to me, is actually the thing that I'm most pessimistic about in America today. So I'm actually quite optimistic about, in the heart of society, how we're relating to each other, about the increase in the number of Americans who have friendships and relationships and business partnerships across these ethnic and religious boundaries, which once seemed monumental. Where I'm really pessimistic is the zero-sum politics and the doom spiral between Democrats and Republicans and the way that makes us hate each other deeply across the partisan divide. And that's something for which we need some solutions. I think California, by the way, does one thing right, which is the so-called jungle primary, right? The fact that you have a little bit more competition for who is on the ballot for the general election. That's one little institutional reform which can help to push us in the right direction. We need more reforms like that to make sure that we don't end up having a civil war between the two factions that are most relevant in the United States today, and that's Democrats and Republicans.
For states where you don't have a jungle primary, let me quickly explain what it is. It is, in effect, a nonpartisan primary election, where instead of the top finisher from one party running in the general election against the top finisher from another party, the two top finishers, period, run against each other. And you eventually get, in many cases, a general election where a local candidate who's a Republican is running against another Republican because they were the two top finishers in the primary. Certainly in California, it is also quite common that the two top finishers for any office are both Democrats and they run against each other, but they often represent different tendencies in the Democratic Party. So it is a reflection of the district itself rather than a Republican who got a tiny number of votes in a very lightly subscribed Republican primary versus a Democrat who got by far and away, head and shoulders above any other candidate, the number one number of votes.
Because, you were talking about mechanisms by which we have forms of minority government, and I agree that that's a deep problem. The most extreme version of this is actually the primary system, because in so many districts around the country, what does an incumbent fear? Not the general election. They fear the primary. The only real threat to them is from their party primary. And how many people vote in those elections? Well, if it doesn't happen to coincide with a presidential election, if it's on, a midterm election, it could be 2-3% of a district that vote in that kind of partisan primary. And so that effectively means that the 5 or so most extreme percent of the population are choosing who represents us in Congress. That is a recipe for a form of ideological minority government, which is really, really destructive.
You've mentioned that you're optimistic, and a lot of your optimism, from the sound of it, rests on interpersonal relations. That apart from government, apart from systems, apart from mechanisms, people make a multicultural democracy work. Yet, what sharpens the conflict inside societies is divvying up the goods, and in most places in the world, government is a big, big factor in how you divvy up the resources of a society, whether those resources are literal and physical and tangible, or simply power and influence over how those decisions are made. Your optimism sounds like it still survives in the face of that paradox.
Well, I think I have those two things at the same time. I'm very pessimistic about the extent of the polarization of our political system. I'm very scared by the fact that We have a former president who did not accept the legitimacy of the election in which he was ousted, and who appears to be planning as best he can to steal the 2024 election if he can. I'm very concerned about the extreme partisan polarization we have, the deep hatred that Democrats and Republicans in this country now have for each other. All of that, I think, is reason for very serious concern. And as somebody who warned about the rise of authoritarian populism before it was cool, as a democracy crisis hipster, I've been talking about these issues and writing about them, including in my last book, for many, many years. But I do also think that precisely in order to be able to stand up to these dangers, precisely in order to be able to avert significant levels of civil violence, precisely in order to rescue our democratic system, we also need to be able to offer a vision to citizens of how our country can be better. And that needs to be based, first of all, on the recognition that we have made some very real progress in the heart of our society in the last decades. It needs to be based on the insistence that most Americans are decent people who are responsive to moral argument, who you can actually appeal to with a positive vision of a kind of country in which they'd want to live. And on the idea that we can make progress in the coming decades without throwing our most cherished and fundamental political principles overboard. That's what I try to offer in my new book, in The Great Experiment, because ultimately the most important question is not whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, it's whether you have some hope and some plan for how to avert the worst outcomes and build a better future. And that's what I try to be useful for.
Is some of this vulnerable to accident of circumstance, of time, of the personalities involved? Because the United States is not the only country wrestling with this, and you didn't say it was, but I want to remind the listener that Canada has a foreign-born population of a much larger percentage than that of the United States. Britain, France, Germany, South Africa, which in its own way is a state cobbled together of different nations over a surprisingly short period of time. You know, a big chunk of the country is known as KwaZulu-Natal, or it was called Zululand before, and the Zulus are not people who had been there for centuries and centuries into a long, hardly remembered past. A lot of the people who are the current national building blocks of modern South Africa are arrivals from a more recent past. And yet, in all their different ways, whether you're talking about Toronto City Council or who's going to sit in the Parliament in Cape Town, they're trying to work out how people who still see themselves not as part of the same enterprise, but still see themselves in many significant ways as being different people, can still get about the work of sharing the place and living in it in a way that leaves them better off at the end. And I wonder if, some of this is going to work in some places and not work in other places, not because people are more or less talented or more or less willing, but more or less wealthy, or the land is more or less gifted with resources, whether the history leaves them in a place that they're more able to get over some of these intrinsic problems that you identify in the book.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So look, some of the basic difficulties are the same in every context. As you just mentioned, South Africa has had a lot of immigration in recent decades from less affluent countries around its border. And actually, you've ended up with some really terrible xenophobic movements within South Africa. And these are people who, in America's slightly limiting scheme of racial classification, would all count as black and all count as part of the same group. But within South Africa, that distinction is incredibly salient. So again, the ability of humans to say, this is our group and you're not part of it, is really multifaceted, and it can take all kinds of different lines. And for any diverse society, that is a huge problem. Then there are background conditions which really matter. It's easier to succeed in a diverse democracy if you are relatively affluent, if people have confidence that the future is going to be better than the past, if they feel that the political institutions are responsive and inclusive, that they're capable of finding decent compromises for contested issues that everybody can live with. So we have work to do in creating that sustained affluence, that economic security, those inclusive institutions. But in the end, some of it is also down to agency and to happenstance, some of which is the question of, does a really dangerous demagogue manage to win election or manage to win re-election? Do the people who oppose that demagogue run on a message which actually appeals to most people in the country, or do they run after the likes on social media of their most hardened supporters? Certainly, I think the fate in the United States is not preordained, which is one more reason for all of us to try and fight for the future of our country and to try and keep this country together in the right way.
National particularity was really discouraged in Yugoslavia. That was part of the Yugoslav project, was to forge a Yugoslavia that wasn't highly self-consciously Croatian or Montenegrin and so on, Slovenian. When it came apart in a horrifying way. Spain continues to wrestle with this even after decades of economic growth and the lifting of the heavy burden of autocracy and dictatorship that it labored under for decades. Spaniards got rich and decided they had the luxury of still nurturing their sectional differences. So it's really hard to see how this all ends, whether people just decide, hey, it's better if we're not at each other's throats after all, or whether some of these differences simply cannot be exceeded, cannot be defeated, and you're just going to have to, as the Czechs and the Slovaks did, find a way to have a divorce.
Look, so this is a book about ethnically and religiously diverse democracies, and in some ways it's an argument for them. It's an argument for how we can manage to sustain the great experiment and make it work. That doesn't mean that I think every country has to follow that example. So there are some countries today which continue to be comparatively homogeneous, like Japan or Bulgaria, and they can make their own decisions about what kind of immigration policy to follow. I think that is something that democratic nations can legitimately determine for themselves. And if people in Japan, for example, want to decide that they are happy to live with significant levels of depopulation and the problems that brings, rather than open the borders to more immigrants, they can legitimately make that decision. A country like Germany, where I grew up, which is now, as you're saying, highly ethnically and religiously diverse, a country like the United States, where I'm now proud to be a citizen, we don't have that choice because we already are incredibly diverse. And you're right to point out that there's been many instances in history where that kind of diversity was ended or destroyed. In Spain, that may happen now with some regional independence movements. It certainly happened in the 14th and 15th century when many people were expelled from the country. We've seen it in the Holocaust. We've seen it in genocides around the world. We've seen it in civil wars of 100 colors and stripes. And so knowing all of that history and having really studied it as I was writing this book, I cannot tell you how it ends. And I don't want to exclude the possibility that some of the countries that are now deeply diverse may once again be quite homogeneous in 200 or in 100 or in 50 years. What I do know is that these processes virtually never happen peacefully. And they virtually never happen without extreme forms of violence and injustice. And so that is a future to be feared rather than one to be desired. Whether you're enthusiastic about the great experiment or whether you're more concerned about it, to think carefully about how do we keep the shop together? How do we manage to overcome the difficulties this diversity does also raise in order to build a thriving society that we're happy and proud to call home?
Well, to close, can you give us an example of a place that's figured it out, that at least for now has managed to massage its differences, find a way to let everybody be who they are, and still operate as a relatively stable, peaceful, and intercommunal polity?
So that's how I started off wanting to write the book. I thought, look, I'll find a couple of examples of places that are doing it really well. And by the way, that'll be fun because then I can go and live there for a while and really report on it. And then I'll tell a great narrative story about what all the things that they got right. And I just don't think that exists. I think there's some countries that are doing a little bit better in one respect and some countries that are doing a little bit better in a different respect. But there isn't the perfect example that we can just go and copy and emulate. What I will say, though, is that it takes a certain amount of historical amnesia to deny the progress we've made in the United States or even in countries like Germany and Australia and so on. If you actually look carefully at the history of our own country and at how unjust it was as recently as 1960, at what popular attitudes were in 1960. I mentioned intermarriage earlier, but there's many other questions you can look at as to how Americans actually felt about each other within living memory. Then I think you inch towards an answer which, given the many things that are dysfunctional about America today, may seem shocking. And it's that actually America is a pretty good example of how to offer people from so many different parts of the world with so many different ethnic identities some real shot at leading a decent life. And we can definitely do a lot better than we are doing right now. But part of that is to resolve to build on the imperfect but real progress that we've actually managed to achieve since 1960, for example.
And I think, dear listener, you would be making a mistake if you are somebody who doesn't share Professor Mounk's optimism to miss the ease with which he refers to our country, meaning his and mine, when he's kind of a result of a series of historical accidents. And if the United States didn't invade my family's ancestral homeland and annex it, meaning that I would be here one day and be living as an American, who knows where in the world I'd be. But yet, in 2022, he absolutely, without a sense of irony or any shading in his voice, says, our country, because it is our country. For better and worse, right?
Well, for better, because I'm very happy to count you as a compatriot after this conversation.
Thanks a lot. I feel the same. Yascha Mounk, it's been a pleasure. The book is The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. Great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf, with additional production support from Dan Zoll and Ryan Housel. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.